In a dusty Texas classroom, a boy with torn shoes and patched up pants raised his hand eagerly. Every time the teacher asked a question, he was the first to reach up, eyes full of hope. But not once did she call on him. His name was George. And to that teacher, George was invisible. Worse, a distraction. The hole in his sneakers, the musty smell of poverty clinging to his clothes, made her wrinkle her nose in disgust. Instead, she chose to praise the principal's son, sitting nearby in his spotless uniform, polished shoes gleaming like they belonged on a different planet. George slowly lowered his hand. The sting of being ignored settled deep in his chest. Day after day, the same thing happened, and day after day, the fire inside him grew. At lunch, the fire finally burst into flames. While the other kids pulled out sandwiches and chips, George sat empty-handed, stomach growling. One boy smirked, holding up his sandwich. "What's the matter? Can't even afford a piece of bread?" Laughter erupted around him. That cheap sandwich, worthless to the others, could have fed George's entire family of 5 for a whole day. Rage bubbled up. Without thinking, George stood up and threw a punch. The kid hit the ground. The laughter stopped. For a brief moment, George wasn't invisible anymore. But that punch changed everything. He knew he'd crossed a line. He also knew something else. He had to get out, before the world crushed him for good. George didn't wait to get expelled. That afternoon he left school and never came back. The streets became his classroom. Abandoned buildings, alleyways, and park benches were his new home. At just 15, he was a ghost drifting through Houston, Texas. No ID, no direction, no plan. He was angry, not just at that teacher or those kids. He was angry at life, at how unfair it all was, at how no matter how hard his mama worked, cleaning other people's houses, working 2 jobs, it never seemed enough. There were always more bills than food, more holes in his shoes than coins in his pocket. At night, he'd sleep on cardboard behind a diner. During the day, he wandered, stealing scraps or panhandling, just to survive. Hunger gnawed at his insides. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. One day, he met another runaway, a little older, a little sharper. The two watched a drunken man stumble out of a bar, flashing a thick wallet. The temptation was too strong. They followed the man into a narrow alley. "Push him down. I'll grab the wallet," his friend whispered. George hesitated, but hunger screamed louder than fear. He shoved the man to the ground. They reached for the wallet and froze. Inside wasn't cash. It was a police badge. Their eyes widened. Panic hit like a truck. Suddenly, flashing lights rounded the corner. Sirens, dogs barking. It was a setup. "Run!" George's friend shouted. They bolted in opposite directions. George dashed through alleys, his lungs burning, legs pumping harder than they ever had in his life. Desperate, he ducked into a half-collapsed shed behind an old house. But the dogs were coming. Fast. Thinking fast, George spotted a pile of manure by the fence. He smeared it all over himself. Face, arms, clothes, every inch. The dogs barked wildly, then hesitated. They sniffed, whimpered, turned away. George sat perfectly still, breath shallow, heart pounding. Covered in filth, he realized something. He was alive. And maybe, just maybe, that meant he still had a shot. A chance to be more than the kid with broken shoes. Still shaking from the chase, George wandered the streets for hours. His clothes crusted in manure, stomach twisting in knots. He needed a way out, but had no idea what that even looked like. That night, as he passed a pawn shop, something in the window caught his eye. A flickering TV screen playing a commercial. On it, a man in a clean uniform stood tall, smiling. "Job Corps can help you learn a skill, earn a paycheck, and build a future." George stopped dead in his tracks. A paycheck? Training? A future? He pressed his face to the glass. For the first time in months, he felt hope. The next day, George found a payphone, dug out his last few coins, and called the number on the screen. He could barely read or write, but he knew how to speak from the gut. He told the voice on the line, "I'm broke. I'm homeless. But I want to work. I want to be somebody." 2 weeks later, George was on a bus headed to a Job Corps center in California. He had no suitcase, just a plastic bag with a toothbrush, 2 shirts, and a pair of tattered jeans. His mama hugged him tight at the station, slipping something into his bag. "You get one shot at a better life," she whispered. "Don't throw it away." When George opened the bag that night in the dorm, he found a note. "Be kind. Be strong. Don't fight. You can do this." And beneath it, a brand new pair of shoes. For the first time in his life, George cried. Job Corps was tough. He didn't know how to use a wrench or hold a hammer properly. His hands were clumsy, his confidence shaky. But he was determined. Still, trouble found him fast. He almost got into a fistfight with his roommate over a bunk bed. He was mocked in class for his slow reading. But every time he wanted to explode, he remembered his mama's note. And somehow he held it together. One afternoon, while unloading supplies, a supervisor named Doc noticed George lift a 200-pound generator like it was nothing. Doc raised an eyebrow. "You ever boxed a kid?" George shook his head. "Just fought on the streets." "Well," Doc chuckled, "maybe it's time you fight for something." Doc led George to the gym, a dusty space with a heavy bag, a speed bag, and a single worn-out ring. George didn't know what to do, so he just punched the bag. Hard. Again. And again. And again. The sound echoed like thunder. Doc's eyes lit up. "That punch," he said, "could knock down a wall." George didn't know it yet, but that was the first time someone had believed in him. And that belief, it would change everything. The gym became George's new world. Every evening after classes, he showed up. No one told him to. No one made him. He was just there, sweating, grunting, swinging until his knuckles bled. Doc, the supervisor, took him under his wing. He wasn't just a staff member. He had been a boxer once, a good one. But now his passion lived on through kids like George. "You've got raw power," Doc told him. "But power without control? That's just chaos." So they started from scratch. Footwork, balance, breathing, jab, cross, hook. Jab again. It was brutal, repetitive, boring, and exactly what George needed. At first, George was all brawn, no brain. He tried to overpower everything. But in the ring, that wasn't enough. His first sparring match was a disaster. His opponent was smaller, quicker, and danced around him like a mosquito. George flailed, missed every punch, and ended up face first on the mat. The room burst into laughter. He wanted to leave, quit, disappear. But as he sat on the edge of the ring, wiping sweat and shame from his face, Doc walked over and said just one thing. "Don't fight angry. Fight smart." That night back in the dorm, George opened his locker and saw his mama's note again. "Be kind. Be strong. Don't fight." He read it over and over, and the next morning he was back in the gym. Weeks passed, then months. George trained harder than anyone. He didn't just hit the bag. He studied. He learned. He watched tapes. He practiced until his muscles ached and his feet blistered. He woke up early to run before the sun rose. Sometimes he'd fall asleep on the gym floor, gloves still on his hands. The boy who once couldn't sit still was now obsessed, with discipline, with growth, with becoming. Then came the tournament. Job Corps was hosting an amateur boxing match between different centers. George was a wild card. No one had heard of him. But when he stepped into that ring, wearing his mother's shoes and carrying her hope in his heart, something clicked. His opponent was good, fast, sharp. But George had something else. Hunger. He took a few hits early on, but stayed calm. He remembered Doc's words. He kept his guard up, watched, waited. Then, an opening. Boom. One punch. Lights out. The room went silent, then erupted. George Foreman had arrived. That victory changed everything. Coaches started paying attention. Scouts called Doc. People began whispering the word Olympics. Doc sat George down that night, pride gleaming in his eyes. "You've got something, son, but this is just the beginning. Don't get cocky, stay humble, stay hungry." George nodded. He wasn't just fighting to win matches anymore. He was fighting for every kid who'd ever been ignored, for every hand that was never called on, for every hole in every shoe. And he was just getting started. The win at Job Corps lit a fire that couldn't be put out. George kept training like a man possessed. He had no backup plan, no safety net. Boxing wasn't just a sport, it was his only way out. Doc made sure George stayed grounded. "You're not fighting other boxers," he reminded him. "You're fighting every excuse you've ever had to give up." Word spread fast. Local fights turned into state tournaments. Every time George stepped into the ring, people held their breath. His punches were thunder. His presence? Magnetic. He wasn't polished, but he was powerful, relentless. Within a year, George qualified for the U.S. Olympic team. The kid who once lived behind a diner was now on a plane to Mexico City, wearing red, white, and blue. At just 19 years old, George stood among the best amateur fighters in the world. The Olympic Village buzzed with energy. Athletes from every corner of the globe. Some had trained their whole lives for this moment. George? He had trained for survival. His opponents underestimated him. He didn't look like a typical boxer. He was raw, heavy-handed, and quiet. No bravado, no pre-fight trash talk, just a storm waiting to be unleashed. Fight after fight, George dominated. Each round, his punches landed like hammers. He was focused, methodical, calm, almost scary in his silence. No one could stop him. Not the European favorite, not the seasoned Cuban fighter, not even the Russian powerhouse in the semifinals. And then, the finals. Gold was on the line. His opponent was fast and technical, the kind of fighter that danced circles around others. But George wasn't like others. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. In the second round, he saw the window. Right hook, uppercut, another right. The referee stepped in. It was over. George Foreman had done the unthinkable. He stood in the center of the ring, draped in an American flag, his arms raised in victory. He hadn't just won a gold medal. He had shattered every label placed on him since birth. Poor, dumb, troublemaker, thug. Now the world knew his name. Back home, people who once looked past him now looked up to him. But George wasn't done. Gold wasn't the finish line. It was the starting bell. Fresh off his Olympic triumph, George Foreman came back to the U.S. a hero. But gold medals didn't pay rent. He was still broke, still hungry, so he turned pro. His first fight, a knockout. Second fight, same. Third, people started to notice. Foreman wasn't flashy. He didn't dance. He didn't play mind games. He came in, fists like sledgehammers, and ended people. One by one, opponent after opponent. Each time he walked out of the ring, the whispers got louder. Could he be the next heavyweight champ? In just a few short years, those whispers turned into roars. George built an undefeated record, 36 wins, 36 fights. Most of them didn't last more than a few rounds. And then came Joe Frazier, the reigning heavyweight champion, a man who had done the unthinkable, defeated Muhammad Ali. Frazier was tough, experienced, and dangerous. Everyone said Foreman was too raw, too young, not ready. But George didn't care what everyone said. The night of the fight, January 22nd, 1973, the world watched with bated breath. Round one. Frazier rushed in like a freight train. George didn't back down. Boom. A right hook sent the champ flying. He got up. Boom. Another knockdown, and another, and another. 6 knockdowns in 2 rounds. By the time the referee stopped the fight, the crowd was stunned. Not just by the win, but by how Foreman had done it. He destroyed the champion. In less than 6 minutes, George Foreman had become the heavyweight champion of the world. At just 24 years old, he stood on top of the world. The kid with nothing had just taken everything. The press went wild. Endorsements, TV appearances, money rolling in faster than he could count. He bought a mansion, cars, suits tailored in silk. Women clung to his arms. Cameras followed him everywhere. He was no longer the invisible boy in the corner of the classroom. He was George Foreman, the most feared man in boxing. But with the crown came pressure, and with pressure came pride. George stopped training like before, stopped listening to Doc. The hunger that once drove him turned into arrogance. Then came the next challenge, a name no one could ignore. Muhammad Ali, the most charismatic fighter the world had ever seen, a man with words sharp as his punches. Ali taunted Foreman in every interview. George hits hard, but he's slow, he grinned. He's like a mummy with gloves. George didn't flinch. He didn't care about the mind games. All he saw was another man trying to take his crown. The world braced for a clash of titans, and they were right. What they didn't know was that it wouldn't go the way George expected. October 30th, 1974. Zaire. The world tuned in for the fight of the century. They called it the Rumble in the Jungle. George Foreman, the undefeated champion. Muhammad Ali, the fallen king looking to reclaim his throne. Ali was older, slower, past his prime, at least on paper. George was younger, stronger, and more feared than ever. Vegas had Foreman as the heavy favorite. But Ali? He had a plan. The fight started with George doing what he did best, pounding. He came out swinging, unleashing heavy blows. Ali leaned against the ropes, covered up, barely fighting back. Commentators were confused. Fans were shocked. Why wasn't Ali fighting? What the world didn't realize was that Ali wasn't retreating. He was setting a trap. He called it the rope-a-dope. For round after round, George punched himself into exhaustion, trying to break through Ali's defense. Every punch threw more of his energy away. His fists were thunder, but Ali was the storm. And all the while, Ali talked to him. "Is that all you got, George?" By round 6, Foreman's breathing was ragged. By round 7, his legs were heavy. By round 8, he was running on fumes. Then it happened. Ali dodged a wild hook, snapped forward, and landed a lightning-fast right. Crack. George stumbled. Then, boom. A clean combo sent the undefeated champion crashing to the canvas. The ref counted to 10. Just like that, Foreman had lost. The stadium exploded. Ali danced. The world cheered. And George sat in stunned silence. Everything he had built came crashing down in one punch. The loss haunted him. It wasn't just the defeat. It was how it happened. Ali had outsmarted him, made him look foolish, weak, predictable. George tried to move on. He kept fighting. He won some, lost others. But something was different. The fire was gone. Worse, the critics turned on him. They called him overrated, said he was only strong when no one fought back, that he was never really a champion, just a bully with gloves. Those words cut deeper than any punch. Within a few years, Foreman had drifted out of the spotlight. Sponsors vanished. The money dried up. He was no longer feared, no longer respected, no longer seen. He tried to come back, tried to regain the hunger. But the man who once lifted a 200-pound generator like it was nothing now looked lost in the ring. Then came a final blow, a humiliating loss to a no-name fighter, a kid no one had heard of. That was it. George quit boxing, for good. He left the ring, dismissed his team, gave away his last remaining money to a friend to manage for him, said he was done chasing fame, done chasing anything. He vanished from the public eye. In the years that followed, George didn't train. He didn't fight. He didn't even talk about boxing. Instead, he found himself in the most unexpected place, a church. The rage that had once fueled his fists turned inward. He wrestled with questions bigger than titles and trophies. Who was he without boxing? And slowly over time, he found peace in the one thing he'd never known, stillness. George became a preacher, a humble one. No spotlight, no roar of the crowd. He traded gloves for sermons, rings for prayer circles. He spoke not of uppercuts and knockouts, but of forgiveness, of grace, of rising after the fall. The former heavyweight champion became the quiet voice in a chapel, guiding lost souls the way Doc once guided him. For a time, that was enough. But destiny wasn't done with George Foreman. Not yet. For nearly a decade, George Foreman lived in peace. Gone were the roar of crowds and flashing cameras. In their place, Sunday services, gospel hymns, and late-night prayers. He was no longer Big George the boxer. He was Pastor George, a soft-spoken man with a Bible in one hand and a heart full of redemption. But life has a way of testing even the strongest faith. One morning, George received news that hit harder than any punch. His entire fortune was gone. The friend he trusted, his former roommate from Job Corps, had gambled it all away. Stocks, investments, even loans in George's name. Every penny was wiped out. Worse still, George was now millions of dollars in debt. He wasn't just broke. He was drowning. The quiet life he'd built was collapsing. He could barely support his growing family. His ministry was at risk. The wolf wasn't just at the door, it had kicked it in. But instead of lashing out, George did something no one expected. He forgave the man. Then he turned to the only thing he knew that could save him: boxing. By now, George was 38 years old, overweight, slower. He hadn't thrown a punch in over 10 years. The sports world laughed. "He's a preacher now," they said. "This is a publicity stunt." But George wasn't joking. He laced up his boots, walked back into the gym, and started from scratch. The man who once ran 10 miles a day could barely jog one. His knees ached. His lungs burned. His punches felt heavy, but not strong. Still, every day he showed up. He ran. He lifted. He punched. Some days he trained in silence. Other days with gospel music blasting through old speakers. People stared. A 260-pound man in his 40s trying to relive a dream long buried. But George didn't care. He wasn't chasing titles this time. He was chasing dignity, a second chance, a way to clear his debts and feed his children. Within a year, he fought his first match back. The crowd was skeptical. Then George stepped into the ring and knocked the guy out, and again, and again, and again. 18 straight wins. Suddenly, no one was laughing. He wasn't the old champ making a fool of himself. He was the comeback story America didn't know it needed. In just 2 years, George paid off every dime of his debt. And more than that, he started inspiring people all over again. Not with rage, not with fear, but with grit and grace. But there was still one mountain left to climb. George didn't just want to fight. He wanted the title, the heavyweight championship of the world. At 45 years old, George Foreman began preparing for the most unlikely battle in boxing history. The world rolled its eyes. His opponent? A man 17 years younger, at his athletic peak, undefeated. The reigning champion, Michael Moore. No one gave George a chance, except George. Because deep down, he wasn't just fighting for a belt. He was fighting for everything he'd lost. November 5th, 1994, Las Vegas, Nevada. The world tuned in, but not to watch George Foreman win. They tuned in to watch him survive. At 45 years old, Foreman was stepping into the ring against Michael Moore, the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, a fighter in his prime, 26 years old, fast, sharp, and lethal. George, on the other hand, was 260 pounds of muscle and history. Critics called him too slow, too old, a relic of a forgotten time. But George didn't come for respect. He came for redemption. The bell rang. From the start, Moore controlled the fight. He peppered George with jabs, circling, staying out of range. Every round, he landed more punches. The commentators called it a masterclass. And still, George didn't panic. He didn't chase. He didn't swing wild. He just waited. Round after round, he absorbed the hits. His face began to swell. His legs slowed. But his eyes stayed sharp. In his corner, his trainers begged him to be careful. "You're behind. If you don't knock him out, you'll lose." George nodded. He already knew. He also knew something no one else did. He wasn't there to win on points. He was there to land one punch. Round 10. Foreman sat still in his corner, breathing slow, calm, a storm waiting to break. When the bell rang, he stepped forward with purpose. Moore was still fresh, bouncing on his toes, landing clean shots. George backed him toward the ropes. Then he struck. A short right hand to the chin. Quick, clean, crushing. Moore stumbled. George stepped in and threw a second right hand, this one from the depths of his soul. Boom! Moore collapsed, flat on his back. The arena erupted. The ref counted. 1, 2 dots, 3 dots. Michael Moore didn't move. 10. It was over. George Foreman was the heavyweight champion of the world. At 45 years old, he had done what no one thought was possible. He didn't just win the fight, he made history. the oldest fighter to ever win the heavyweight title. As the referee lifted his hand, George didn't scream. He didn't pound his chest. He didn't jump on the ropes. He just smiled, a quiet, humble smile. He had climbed back from ruin, paid off every debt, silenced every critic, and reclaimed the crown that was once stolen from him, not with anger, but with grace, faith, and patience. In the post-fight interview, he didn't gloat. Instead, he said, "This victory isn't about age. It's about belief. If you have a dream, you're never too old or too late to chase it." That night, George wore the same red trunks he had worn 20 years earlier when Ali knocked him out in Zaire. The same shorts, but a different man. He wasn't driven by rage anymore. He had found peace. And in doing so, he had become the people's champion, a symbol of perseverance, of never giving up, of standing back up no matter how many times you've fallen. His story became more than a comeback. It became a legacy. George Foreman could have stayed down. He could have disappeared after losing to Ali, could have surrendered when he went broke, could have blamed the world when life kicked him over and over. But he didn't. He stood back up, again and again and again. Not just in the ring, but in life. He became more than a fighter. He became a symbol, a reminder that it's never too late to begin again. From a forgotten boy with holes in his shoes, to Olympic gold medalist, to world champion, to preacher, to broke, to champion again. Foreman's life teaches us something that no title belt ever could. True strength isn't about muscle, it's about mindset. Being knocked down is part of life. Staying down is a choice. It's not how you start, it's how you finish. Today, George Foreman is not only a boxing legend, he's a successful entrepreneur, a family man, and a mentor to countless young athletes. But more than all that, he's living proof that failure is not final. Because every one of us, no matter our age, background, or past mistakes, has a fight worth fighting. Whether it's to rebuild our life, earn back trust, or simply prove to ourselves that we're not done yet. George Foreman didn't win because he was lucky. He won because he refused to quit. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes a real champion.